Mayad nga adlaw gid sa inyo tanan, ilabi na gid ang tanan nga mga participants sa JAGA training. How are you, dear participants? I hope you are still okay, especially that our department is still battling right now of the pandemic caused by COVID-19. I do believe you still have that interested mind to listen to my discussion, especially the DepEd order that I'll be discussing to you this day. The topic that I will be discussing to you this time is for us iPad implementers to be reminded of the considerations we should put in mind upon using materials involving aspects of indigenous people's culture in our community. So I am tasked to discuss to you the guidelines on the conduct of activities and use of materials involving aspects of indigenous people's culture. Anyway, I am Sheila May Marbebi Abismo of the District of Haniway 1, the iPad focal person. Antes kita magpadayon sa pag-discuss sa DepEd Order number 51 series of 2014, there are two objectives that we need to attain. So first, discuss the provisions in the DepEd Order number 51 series of 2014. And second is to contextualize the DepEd Order number 51 series of 2014 in reference to the indigenous cultural communities or ICCs being served. Those are the objectives of this session. I presume some have already read the memorandum, but to those who are not familiar, don't worry. This is the reason why I am here. This is the reason that we will be discussing it today. So, DepEd Order number 51, series of 2014. Again, this is the guidelines on the conduct of activities and use of materials involving aspects of indigenous people's culture. This is dated December 19 of 2014. Why do you think this DepEd order was formulated? So this is based on the DepEd Order number 62, series of 2011. In line with the National Indigenous Peoples Education or IPED policy framework, this is the DepEd Order number 62, series of 2011. Particularly, the policy thrust to implement stronger affirmative action to eradicate all forms of discrimination against IP in the entire Philippine education system. And of course, to uphold and advocate the protection of the intellectual property rights of indigenous peoples. The Department of Education, or DepEd, is adopting the enclosed guidelines on the conduct of activities and use of materials involving aspects of indigenous people's culture. So, again, the DepEd Order number 51 series of 2014 is just based on DepEd Order number 62 series of 2011. Aligned with the principles of the K-12 curriculum, these guidelines seek to promote among learners and the teaching and non-teaching staff of learning institutions cultural sensitivity, respect for cultural diversity, and a deeper understanding of the cultural expression of indigenous peoples. These are meant to provide guidance on the ethical assessment of the conduct of learning activities and related engagements of schools, DepEd offices, and other educational initiatives which involves various aspects of indigenous people's culture. So these guidelines seek to promote among learners and the non-teaching and teaching staff of learning institutions cultural sensitivity, respectful cultural diversity, and a deeper, madalom gid nga pag-intindi kang indigenous people's culture. So, since this is a DepEd order, we as IPED implementers has nothing to do but to abide the order itself. This DepEd order was signed by Brother Armin Luistro, the DepEd secretary that time. Now, let us go deeper with the enclosure to DepEd Order number 51 series of 2014. Let us now proceed to its policy background. So, padalman din natin ang DepEd Order number 51 series of 2014. The localization and contextualization trust of the enhanced basic education curriculum direct all schools and learning programs to relate curriculum content and competencies to the social and educational context of communities being served. So this is the reason why we have been trained already as facilitators of learning of how to localize and contextualize our learning competencies on different subject areas for better and more relevant learning to among our learners. So, as of now, we are already using in our classrooms, ginagamit din natin sa atin nga eskwelahan o kung biskan sa modular natin tilad nga pamaagi sa pagtuon ang mga contextualized nga mga materials from our DepEd portal. So we can already experience this as of the moment. So for school, learning programs located in indigenous peoples communities and or with indigenous learners, one aspect that will define the curriculum context will be the community's culture and realities. In recent decades, the cultural expressions, like for example, the dances, the songs, music, artifacts, symbols of IP communities have gained attention for use in various learning activities and in the school environment. So textiles, clothing, and other artifacts of indigenous cultural communities or our ICCs have been used in school displays and decorations. So, kita nyo maran kong kaisa. Makita nyo sa akin palibot. These artifacts, mga makitaan sa atin nga communities, pwede natin magamit sa school presentations with example like this, nag-take a video in this virtual training. So I used these indigenous materials as decoration. So pwede din natin magamit, but of course, we have to be very careful because it is embodied here in this DepEd Order number 51 series of 2014. Dances and songs have been used as intervention numbers in programs, while stories and the community's knowledge have been made part of the teaching and learning process. Some have viewed this effort as an opportunity to raise social awareness about the presence of IP communities and their particular culture. Amo ini ang mangin basihan of the ethical assessment of activities organized by schools, DepEd offices, and other educational programs with due consideration of the specific circumstances and context wherein decisions are made. It can also be used to guide discussions of schools with external parties regarding invitations to participate in activities outside the school. Now, let us discuss on cultural presentations, festivals, and similar activities. The purpose of activity should promote cultural sensitivity sensitivity and respect for diversity. So let us be mindful of this word sensitivity and diversity. We have to be sensitive as iPad implementers of this what we call cultural diversity. The activity should promote a dignified appreciation for the community and its culture. So, syempre, as iPad implementers, dapat ikaw mismo, you know how to make use of these presentations and festivals with accordance to community and its culture. So the activity should not commercialize indigenous culture nor use financial activities as undue motivation. So hindi pwede commercialize ang ating mga indigenous culture nor use financial incentives. The activity should foster an appreciation of the performance or presentation from the standpoint and standards of the community and avoid inappropriate comparison and competition. Presentation should be appropriate to the purpose of theme of the activity. And we should not forget kagibutanggid sa aton nga mga paminsaron that before we make use of certain activities in our lessons or maybe festivals of a specific IP community or their presentation, we have to consider gid ang permission kang aton mga IP communities. Prior to the activity, the appropriate process of seeking permission from the community to present aspects of indigenous culture should be observed. The purpose and intention of the activity should be clearly and accurately communicated to the community whose cultural expression is to be shared. And the presentation should adhere to the standards and other stipulation of the community. So kung may mga ginapatihan na ang mga community nga di ang ginbulaan mo ka cultural presentation and you will make use of this certain presentation or a certain festival sa imong mga lesson, so kinanglan kung ano ang patakaran sa isang komunidad antes mo di agamitan, dapat sundon gid natin as iPad implementers. Authenticity and preparatory concerns in the conduct of the activity should be addressed. So, we have community participants should be properly briefed about the purpose of the activity and the other details. So, example, the background of the audience, the expectations, the venue, and other related concerns. So, example, gamitin mo di ang festival, dapat gid nga ihambal mo man to sa certain iPad community nga ang festival nanda gamitin dya sa akin nga classroom lang man, mga bata lang malantaw. They should know. They have the right to know kung sino ang imo paabutan kadi ang indigenous culture nanda. So, participants in the presenting group should be the appropriate and duly chosen representatives of the community. So, just like for example, before we had a demonstration teaching, one of my fellow demonstration teacher asked the presence of IP leader in a community para manginkabahin man kaana nga lesson. So you can do that also. Resource persons for the activity should be recommended by the community. So in using a person, in your certain class, kung gamitin mo siya as resource person, dapat may permission gid from the elders or guranga sanda gid kung mga ma-endorso kadi ang tawo nga tana ang maging resource person mo. As much as possible, culture bearers should be present from planning to execution. This sacred dimension of the presentation, if any, should be observed. Example, the ritual that should be done before the presentation. Kay may dyan na nga mga presentation nga kailangan pa mga rituals So we have to be careful about it. Adequate preparation time for the presentation as deemed necessary by the community should also be observed. So adequate presentation. Authenticity of elements of the presentation should be given due attention. And availability of the needed materials should be considered in deciding whether or not an activity is to be held. The values being communicated by cultural expression should be maintained also. So elements of the cultural expressions should not be modified and or exaggerated for the sake of the presentation. So we have to remember this also, na hindi natin pwede i-exaggerate, i-bulak-bulakan mo pagid dyan ang isa ka cultural presentation para magnami pagid. Because kung amo lang ta na dia ang kaungdan, kaanda nga presentation, kaanda nga culture nanda, amo lang ta na dia. So, to continue, the historical background and context of the presentation should be clearly communicated, preferably by the community member designated. So, historical background and context of the presentation. Kinanglan, insakto gid, klaro gid nga na paabot natin sa mga elders in the community. Opportunity and adequate time for the audience to raise questions and clarification, if any, is also to be provided. Now, we will proceed to the use of indigenous clothing and related paraphernalias. Indigenous clothing or garments should be referred to as costume since, again, indigenous clothing or garments should not be referred to as costume. Should not be referred to as costume. Hindi natin pag-refer nga costume since the cultural context of these materials is not for a show. So, for teachers and other DepEd personnel who do not belong to the indigenous community, the permission of the community should be sought before wearing their indigenous clothing and related paraphernalia, and the clothing is to be used in accordance with community's practice and the meanings they associate with its use. For example, proper occasion and context. Example of the IP community here in Iloilo from Calino. So, kung gamitin natin ang anda nga costume, so kinanglan mga yugid, I'm so sorry. So, kung gamitin nanda ang nga paanda nga ginasuksok nga di ang dosaya o kung bayo nanda dyan, hindi natin pag-refer nga costume, kag dapat may permission gid nanda antes natin suksukon in a certain presentation o kung sa class discussion man. Indigenous clothing and related paraphernalia should not be imitated, used for commercial purposes, or made fun of. So, hindi pwede nga irigirigan mo lang tanato ang panapton, ang bisti ka mga taga-Kalino, kay taga-Haniway taten, IP ba taten, himo, or taga-Haniway kami abi, irigirigan naman to ang anak ka taga-Kalino, hindi pwede. So, may mga nagakaangay man tana or may dyan man tanda ka di ang bayo gid nga ginasuksok lain sa kada komunidad, IP community. So hindi man natin di pwede nga irag-iragan kag ibaligya kag ang pinagid ka importante, hindi natin pwede kadlawan ang panapton tana of a certain IP community. Now, let us discuss on the use of community artifacts. So, appropriate permission still should be sought before artifacts are used for whatever purpose. So, in the absence of an opportunity to appropriately seek permission, the use of artifacts should be deferred. So, kung gamitin mo, kinanglan, maglisensya ka gid ka insakto o in a certain IP community. Kag kung mo ay ikaw kalisensya, pag duha-duha din ikaw nga gamitin. Kay basi, balikan ikaw kaaten nga mga IP people. in a certain community nga ginbulan mo kato nga mga artifacts. Appropriate permission should be sought when taking pictures or videos of artifacts. So, antes kita magbual ka picture, magamit ka picture nga related in the IP culture, dapat gid nga mangayo anay kita ka o maglisensya anay kita in a certain IP community. Reproduction of artifacts should be decided upon by the community. So, hindi man galit di pwede nga ma-picture lang ti mo tapos himuon mo nga postcard kag ibaligya mo because dapat malisensya ka anay sa IP communities. Duro pa di ang agya natin. So, understanding the origin and proper use of the artifacts should be a prerequisite to their use. Basi ang di ang artifact gali may madalom pagid nga gina-symbolize. So, dapat man anin maranaton. Sacred artifacts should not be used for presentation and other activities that the communities deems to be in appropriate context for their use. So, amo dia ang mga pagsurundan naton on the use of community artifact. Mapadayon pagid kita on the use of community symbols. The permission of the community should be sought before using community symbols. So again, we have the word permission. Permission man gihapon before using these community symbols. The use of symbols, if allowed, should be in accordance with community's protocols, standards, and attributed meanings. Kay mga simbolo nga dia of a certain community, syempre may kabahin din dia nga mga meaning. The community's ownership of the symbol should be recognized. So, dapat man-anan gid naton kung diin di naghalin, kag itagid natin nga anda kita na ana dya ka simbolo nga dya naghalin sa IP ka mga taga-Barasalan. So, ngayon gid natin kadia, hindi natin pag-i-claim nga inyo rayan nga ginhimo. So, on publications, videos, and other related materials. Appropriate permission, again, should be sought in producing publications, videos, and other related materials. So, articles in newsletters, exhibits, posters, multimedia, outputs, is to be made about the community. So, permission man japon. So, we have again the word permission. Example, take videos kita in a certain IP community. Again, we have the word ask permission. Content of materials about the community should promote understanding and respect for the community's culture. Dapat, if we make videos, video clips about a certain community, dapat hindi nga himuon nga mangin karadlawan ng isa ka IP community. We have to pay respect to them. So the final content, including visuals or pictures and artworks and local terms used, should be cleared and validated in the community. So again, example, if you take a certain video in a certain IP community, dapat mabalik ka man dyan to sa community and again, show your output, yung kananda abi, kag pamangkuton ang mga gurang, mga elders, kag mga nakamaan, tuya kung insakto gid man ang mga wordings mo dyan nga gingamit before you published that certain video. Appropriate permission should be sought if outputs of community members, artworks, write-ups are to be included in such materials. So, there you go. Na himay-himay din natin kung paano, ano ang dapat natin obrahan, especially when using symbols, videos, related materials, artifacts, antes natin gamitin di sa atin paghimo abi ka atin contextualized modules na para sa atin mga kabataan. The above guidelines do not limit additional protocols and standards that specific indigenous communities may wish to be observed in the course of their engagement with schools and DepEd offices. All DepEd personnel and other learning programs projects should be guided by the basic principles of free, prior, and informed consent and respect for cultural integrity. Private learning institutions and education initiatives are also enjoined to observe these guidelines. So dapat, because this is a DepEd order, we have really to follow the guidelines. So that was about the DepEd order number 51, series of 2014. Again, it is the guidelines on the conduct of activities and use of materials involving aspects of indigenous people's culture. So tandaan lang natin pirme, fellow iPad implementers, that we have to follow the process and go back kita sa mga ginapatihan kaaton nga mga tumando. Antis naton gamiton ang bisan ano lang nga materyales kag mga hilikuton nga ginahimo kaaton nga mga tumando. Thank you very much, Gid, sa inyo pagpamati kag time. So, enjoy learning.